So hello and welcome listeners, and for the first time, very excitingly, viewers. So we've brushed our hair, we've done our makeup, John's beard is ready. Welcome to the Medical Protection Podcast. We'll be bringing you both the podcast you'd expect, but also a new thing called a vodcast. You need to think about it like a behind the scenes view. So if you've ever wondered what faces are behind these voices, now's your chance to find out. You can access the vodcast via the links in the description. I'm your host, Dr. Katie Grant, and today I want to take you back to a familiar topic, which is speaking up for respect and wellbeing. We focused on this earlier in the year, and now that some time has passed, we thought it might be interesting to revisit it to prompt our regular listeners to consider what changes you might have made and what impacts it's had for you. Now, we're not going to go through the top tips or highlights from other previous podcasts, but instead I'm speaking with the wonderful Professor John Sandars to explore his research, which is titled Performance Resilience Enhancement by Solution and Strengths-Based Training, or PREST for short, you'll be glad to hear. John is a recipient of one of the research grants from the MPS Foundation. And just to mention the foundation, this is a global not-for-profit research initiative founded by MPS. We aim to shape the future of patient safety and the wellbeing of healthcare professionals and teams. And they sponsor a number of topics globally with a focus on private hospital, outpatient practice and dental care environments. So with that being said, I'd like to say hello to John. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Okay, thank you, Katie.
And I've obviously mentioned the title of your topic, which is a bit of a mouthful, but could you, for perhaps the non-experts who are listening, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience and how you started sort of research in this area?
Sure. My background initially was in hospital medicine, and then I moved into general practice, but I was in the halcyon days when actually GPs were quite involved with direct patient care. So I used to do a lot of GP obstetrics, actually, involved with the deliveries, starting off in deliveries. So I've always been interested in how doctors perform.
Yeah.
But equally so, I've been always aware of the impact in which feeling stressed or anxious can actually impair your performance. Now, and particularly during the performance, when it's not going right, how do you actually help yourself? But also the impact immediately afterwards. And also the fact that over a period of time, the more anxious you become, it starts to impair your performance long term. So I've always been particularly interested in that area. I then became more and more interested in training doctors and eventually became a part-time academic, and then eventually moved into medical education as a more of an academic subject.
Yeah.
And during some of my discussions with colleagues, we became interested in what's called marginal gains theory. And this came from work related to the Sky cycling team. Because there, Beresford talked about you only needed to make a very small change, lots of small changes, to make a major change. And so I was working with some colleagues and we wrote an article about it. We became more interested in how sports could actually develop both the skills of doctors to cope with the stress that they were under and how to deal with it before, during, and after doing particular challenging situations, which many doctors face.
Yeah.
And then we started to do some work with anaesthetists, and the models they tended to use were coming from aviation, but that didn't. Aviation is quite it goes through numerous checklists, and although that's useful, we felt that sports is much more fluid and open.
Yeah.
So we then started to become more interested in, well, can we learn anything from sportsmen? So we then conducted a systematic review of how sports psychology had been used in training doctors. And we found that there were several interventions, but there wasn't the perfect intervention. There were still gaps in the knowledge. And then I had a PhD student who was interested in this area, who was an anaesthetist as well. So she developed a model which started to look at how to use particular skills before, during a procedure. So, for example, if you look at a footballer who's going to kick a goal, to try to score a goal, as they go up to the ball, you'll see that they often stop, they take a good breath in, they seem to focus on that. And what they're doing is blocking out all the outside noise, all the fans chanting at them. That they going through their mind, they're also telling themselves, I've done this 100 times before, I know what it is. They visualize what a perfect kick is, the stride that they do, the strength of it, where they're going to aim for. And then they do it. And these are called pre-performance routines. And we found that junior doctors actually do use similar techniques to sport. So we became even more interested in this. And at Edge Hill University, we have a strong sports psychology department. So I've been chatting to them, and they were particularly interested in what's called talent development, because what they found is that for athletes, and that includes all sportsmen, it's a general term people tend to use, that there were differences between highly successful performers and not so successful performers. And these were quite a range of techniques before, during, and after an event. And so there were things like getting ready on the day of the event before they're doing things. There were things which, if they were, whatever they were doing, whether they were playing football, tennis, they were using particular what's called pre-performance routines that they were going through just before they're going to do it. So this is very closely around performance, and that's why we use the term performance resilience. It's a term which we've coined because then it's resilience very much focused on doing a particular sports task. And then afterwards, what are they telling themselves afterwards? Are they beating themselves up? So what we were interested in is whether we could apply some of this work to doctors. So we thought, well, how can we best do that? Most doctors are probably doing some of these skills. The question is, are they doing them all the time? And some research from elite sportsmen is that they are quite variable on how they do these skills. So they're not consistent in using them. So we wanted to try and develop an approach to see whether to help people to use these skills more consistently. So the first thing is, well, could we use existing tools in sport to help individuals to identify their particular strengths? What are they using? What are these skills that they're using? And then once they've identified them, is how can they build them up and how can they maintain using those? So we were fortunate to get one of these MPSF, Medical Protection Society Foundation development grants, which will allow us to, first of all, do some work to see, is this actually just rubbish? It seems a good idea.
It's a good place to start, isn't it? Is this actually just
rubbish? That's right.
Yes.
So we want to do some interviews.
Yes.
And then what we want to do is to then, from those interviews, decide which are the categories in one of the sports questionnaires that is widely used and has been validated in sportsmen. What questions seem to be relevant to their particular context as being a doctor? Because obviously it talks of things like match play during this and during that. It's because it's designed for sportsmen, but I'm sure that we can adapt it and develop it. So we're going to develop that questionnaire related to the medical context, particularly in surgeons and anaesthetists and obstetricians. And then what we intend to do is to then administer that to a large range of people in those groups. Ideally, what we would like is several hundred. So first of all, we've got a survey tool to find out the extent, but also we can then find what's called the validation of that questionnaire. Once we've got that, we can then develop a bespoke training package for doctors with the sports psychologists, which helps individuals to identify which of these areas in the questionnaire are strengths and not so much strengths. And then the areas which they haven't got so much strengths in, we can give them hints on how to develop it.
Yeah.
What we found from the review on using some aspects of sports psychology, it tends to be pretty didactic. So basically, you're given a whole range of things and told, just do those. But actually, we all know that if it's not relevant to the individual, you either forget about most of them or you just ignore them. So this is very much about individual strengths-based, and that's why we use the word strengths-based.
Great. So going back, so you talked about something like pre-performance routines and visualization. What are the other, because again, I've got a friend who's a surgeon. I just texted him before we did this and said, do you have any pre-surgical routines? And he said, I wash my hands. Genuinely, that is his answer. And I was an anaesthetist. And occasionally I would literally go in and talk to myself in the mirror if I was trying to egg myself, if there was a really difficult case coming up. I occasionally would go and say, come on, you can do this. More out of desperation, I think, than anything else. So this to me makes sense, but I'm not sure that I've ever consciously thought about routines. So what other things are you thinking to transfer? So you've got the pre-performance routines. So you said about the sportsman taking a penalty kick, or the sports person taking a penalty kick, the footballer. You said they may do a breath. They may, I see when you watch the TV, you see them doing like signs, or they may be saying a prayer. What do these routines consist of, or are they a real mix of things?
They're a real mix of things. And the thing about it is that what we found from our review, which was mainly surgeons, that most of the work has been done in surgeons, and most of the work has been done in America by one or two particular groups. That's all. And what they've done, they've developed a package which teaches about 10 of these. But in fact, if you look at sportsmen, they have their own idiosyncratic approaches, which they find particularly works. And work with Olympic athletes in Finland by Hannin has shown that, in fact, individuals have usually 2 or 3 which they consider, which they repeatedly use, and which they find really works. The difficulty with the sportsman is that they don't consistently use them. So, they don't tend to use them when they're actually under a lot of stress, that they sort of, the stress takes over and they forget to use them. So the argument is the fact that you don't need to learn all of them. You just need to identify which ones you particularly you find useful. What most people find useful are visualization.
Yeah.
There's like this internal video camera movie goes on. I've done that before, and you see yourself. I've done this before. I've done that before.
Sorry, just to clarify. So if I was going to do a difficult intubation, for example, I would go through the steps of my preparation, the equipment, and then I would sort of in my head, I would visualize what I'm going to do. I'm going to put the oxygen on 100%. So you'd literally go through each step of the process. Is that what you mean by visualization?
You can do that, but also you can visualize that the times when you've done it really successful, these difficult things. So you
like
are
the
bringing
winning.
You bring back the memories of when you were highly successful.
Oh gosh. See, that to me is very alien as an anaesthetist. It's always the worst.
Yes.
You're preparing for the worst. I don't think I've ever thought, well, it worked that time, so it's going to work this time. It's always, well, it worked that time, but I was probably just lucky. So that's a real mind shift, I think, particularly for perhaps those of us who may be of that more negative end of a scale, I would say. So visualizing. Yes. Go ahead.
I was going to say, doctors tend to be either super confident and not, or the opposite.
Absolutely, and we see that no more in no more clear clarity than in a trainee anaesthetist. So you do your novice period, so you do a few weeks supervised, and then one lot will go off and merrily do their own thing, and then there's the other end of things who are very cautious. And ultimately, I think people level out once experience has sort of has brought them to more of an even keel. So you're actually visualizing. So if you were a footballer, you're visualizing that penalty being scored. Sorry, I'm not a football fan, but you're visualizing the goal, a goal being scored, or you're visualizing, the successful outcome of your intubation. So it's not necessarily the steps; it's actually thinking about when you've done it and you've got it in the, in the right spot.
It can be a mixture of both.
Okay.
Some people go through repeatedly the steps.
Yeah.
And what it feels like doing it. It's I know we're calling it visualization.
Yeah.
It's sort of reenacting it.
Yes.
It's for athletes particularly. They tend to also focus on sort of the muscle, that feel of running up to the ball. So they're getting sort of the muscles prepared, they're mentally prepared. So they're reenacting that process. They are, but they also often visualize success as well.
Gosh, and there's evidence this works
In sportsmen, yes.
Okay.
There's evidence that it works in doctors as well,
Yes.
but unfortunately, not every person does a lot of visualization.
Yeah.
If they do visualization, it's useful. It might be a useful skill, but some people don't tend to use visualization very much. What they do, they block everything out.
Yes.
So they almost create a quiet zone for themselves. So thought blocking, that it's about, they block out not just people's speech, but the environment.
Yeah.
The fact that you've got onlookers. Yeah, you block out onlookers. You block out all the chatter people.
Yes.
Around you. You just focus and do that. The other thing is you start blocking out thought blocking, where you're telling yourself. This is the particularly Peters's work on about the chimp. Really, you stop the chimp on your shoulder telling you you're useless and all this sort of stuff.
I mean, that's like the CBT style. I mean, I was thinking about inner voice and monologue, because I'm amazed that my husband, for example, doesn't have an inner monologue. He was saying, whereas I've got this constant. I know it sounds. I've got almost a constant stream of saying. If I go and meet someone, I'll be like, "Oh, why did you say that? You're such an idiot," or whatever. I have this like virtually all the time, and my husband has nothing like it. So, can you learn techniques then to turn off this inner critic?
Yes, and also the opposite. Also the opposite, to give yourself the positive, so you can learn the techniques. And the thing about it is, if you don't do it, it might be useful to learn the technique.
Yeah.
But you may do it, but you're not doing it all the time, and particularly when the going gets tough. So that's what's important to identify as well.
Okay.
And each one is a marginal gain, which is interesting. So each one can actually contribute to that. Yeah.
And we talk about marginal gains. We have a virtual workshop that's beating burnout, which is available for all our members free of charge. So it's 2 hours, and we talk about, the British cycling success. And these marginal gains, like you say, the things like even having your own pillow so you sleep better, teaching the cyclists to wash their hands properly so they get less bugs and things. And I think there's that, to me, that's really appealing. Anything that you can do that's a small step that can have a really big cumulative effect. I'm interested. So you talked about this idiosyncratic, they have their idiosyncrasies, their own sort of preparation routines.
Yeah.
Do people teach sports persons to select those? Or, I mean, how do you learn to have an effective routine is what I'm trying to ask you. Or can you learn?
Yeah. Well, if you chat to the sports psychologists, this is where the debate is. The majority of sports psychologists appear, and I'm not a sports psychologist, I'm only giving it hearsay, but what they say is that most of them teach only one or two techniques. And that's what the sports psychologists believe in and teach in. So what you find in the research is that it's quite a lot of it is still didactic. This is the way that I think you should do it. And they just train them and train them and train them with one or two or a few techniques.
So that might be visualization, or that might be, before you do anything, I want you to take a big breath, ground yourself type thing. Okay, great.
Yeah.
They're telling them what they think will work.
Yeah. And some of them teach a whole variety of them and tell them to do all of them.
Gosh.
But the trouble is that if you look at the research of them, those particular approaches, it doesn't work for everybody, these systems.
Yeah.
So then they've been looking at, well, why doesn't it work?
Yeah.
It works once. It works for some people, so why doesn't it work for
Yes.
others?
Work
And
for
what it
others. Yeah.
appears to be is the fact that there's a thing called old way, new way. As we've always said, it's difficult to teach an old dog new tricks. So once you get into using a
Yeah.
particular routine which is idiosyncratic,
Yeah.
why are you bothering to teach them a new technique? Because they've already developed that technique. Most people, I know you were talking about your husband not doing
Yeah.
this in a dialogue, but he's probably doing something else. Most people do something. And the work that Helen did look at with junior doctors is that across the group of junior doctors, okay, it was only a small number, but they were using slightly different techniques, the doctors were themselves as well. And there's a group of sports psychologists, particularly by Hannin in Finland, who actually said, we need to focus on the idiosyncratic approaches and make sure that they use them more consistently. And he says that what individuals need is to be in this zone of optimization, he calls it, where their performance is optimized and it's consistent. That's what makes, he says, makes the difference between the really good performers and the not so good performers. They are consistently good. So every time they're out there, it's working. They don't have the dips.
So it may not be what necessarily you're doing, but it's the fact you're doing it consistently and that it works for you to enhance your... So I
if
want
it's
to get
not
back to
working, you might need to develop a technique, a new technique.
Yes.
That's what he would say. So therefore, you need to identify, see whether it, check whether it's working or not. And if it isn't, well, you could try another technique. And that's why we're suggesting this self sort of awareness questionnaire or self-awareness approach, rather than just giving a didactic course on this is how you should do it.
Yes, because this is what I'm interested, because this sounds great. And I think all medics would like to be compared to elite sports persons, right? I think there's a lot of comparison. You're at that point, particularly in surgery and obstetrics and anaesthesia, the groups you're going to be looking at. There's that point where you've got to do something, you've got to do it right. Otherwise, there's really serious outcomes. The thing I'm not, my inner cynic is saying, this sounds great, John, but the resource and the time and the training, do you think this is a feasible thing that junior doctors will have the resources even to be supported to develop this?
Well, I think I think that there's several issues. First of all, can people be trained and how much training do you need? In Helen's PhD, junior doctors certainly improved their self-confidence in using these techniques and managing. But the group wasn't large enough to have specific measures. If you then look at it in surgeons, there's no doubt that using some of these techniques improves surgical skills. The problem is it tends to be quite reductionist in surgical skill. So it's not sort of whole operations. These are things like suturing under pressure and things like that, using various models or virtual reality and things. But there is evidence to show that it is teachable in doctors. And if you look at how many sessions, this is where the difficulty starts coming, because the research is quite heterogeneous. If you look at it from sports people, what they would recommend is that you have like all training, you develop some awareness, you develop some skills, and then you put that repeatedly into action yourself. And then after a period of time, you see where you're going. Now, we're not going to have the opportunity in this particular research project because it's only for a year. And that's all we had the funding for. We're only going to be able to develop the initial sort of phase one of it all. Once we've got that, what we will be then looking at is actually rolling this out and measuring these types of outcomes in a longer term. And what we would see in an ideal system is that it would be more like a coaching model. So you get a group of doctors and it could be part of all training.
Yeah.
So actually, there is some sort of general discussion, there's some video, and then they practice it themselves. And then there's some coaching. And we say, well, who's going to do that coaching? Well, one opportunity could actually be sports psychologists.
Yeah.
And I hope, there's not too many sports psychologists sort of reading this, but if you look at the number of people who do sports and sports psychology at university, it's quite high.
Yeah.
But how many of them actually become highly involved in sports psychology? The majority of people end up doing things like becoming personal trainers, working in sports centres, becoming sports teachers. And, there's no reason why you can't have a performance coach within a particular, a trust, because the amount of money that the wages is comparable to any other allied health professional. And in fact, sports psychologists, can be regarded. Sports psychologists are already employed within the health area. But what they tend to focus on is things like exercise to improve, mental well-being. So there is this cohort there. But like most things, individual psychologists have particular research interests.
Yeah. So this, I wish we could talk longer, John, because this sounds fascinating. I really want to know how this is progressing, because obviously members are going to be involved with the questionnaires and research. And obviously, I think we could all probably learn some stuff from this, whether we're practicing or not. So I'm gonna summarize. So basically, you're doing this year-long project. You're looking at sports psychology approaches in medicine, particularly anaesthetics, obstetrics, and surgeons, with the hope that this will potentially lead to developing personalized plans, basically, for doctors to have their own techniques, which will help improve performance. You said it builds self-confidence, and presumably it can reduce burnout. Is that some of the evidence?
Well, absolutely. We know that if you're not performing well, doctors have a high conscientious index, because the biggest success factor at university in the big five, your personality trait, is being highly conscientious. And that is what you need to be. The flip side to it is that you tend to beat yourself up when things go wrong. So when you beat yourself up going wrong, that has a major impact, obviously, on your mental health and general well-being. And there are other factors as well, because if there are other aspects in your life are going on. But if we focus around sport and performance, we know that sportsmen go through exactly the same, that they're beating themselves up afterwards. And, it's how do they bounce back as well? So actually the questionnaire does identify some of these aspects. So it's about, how do they prepare themselves before they're doing things? Getting into that frame. How do they, as they're about to do a task, the performance, get themselves into the optimum? And then afterwards, how do they stop beating themselves up afterwards?
So use it productively, learn from failure as opposed to dragging yourself down.
That's right. So what we're trying to do is to create this package and then create some videos. And obviously, as we're doing that, we want to be developing it with future users to ensure that what we're providing is relevant. And fortunately, we've got sports psychologists who are experienced in running this type of work and do coaching for elite athletes. So I'm sure that we can create a relevant package by the end of it. And that's what we intend to do by the end of the year. We intend to have basically two major outputs. One is the questionnaire that's validated, that we can use for doctors as a self-assessment tool, but also as a survey tool, and also this series of videos which are the basis of a training package. The next level is to then have a training package which we then begin to implement and evaluate.
Great. John, thank you so much. I think we need to get you back to hear about the outcomes of the questionnaire, because I think I've got so many more questions, and it's a really fascinating area. And it sounds like actually it could be applied to lots of non-medics as well, right? We all, even in our own lives, I think we could all do with more resilience and perhaps, turning off that inner critic. So thanks so much, John.
Thank you.
So we're reaching the end of today's podcast, and you've been listening and maybe even watching Professor John Sandars. We hope the conversation's been really interesting and helped you consider how far you might have come on your own journey to improve your well-being, and maybe start thinking about techniques you can use in your own workplace to build that resilience. Once more, today's conversation can be viewed as a video recording, and for the recording and more information, please take a look in the podcast description below. I've been your host, Katie Grant, and thank you so much for joining us.